Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're delving into one of the strangest chapters of Victorian medicine, the terrifying invention once used to cure women of hysteria. It's a story of ignorance, science, and suppressed emotion, all wrapped in brass, velvet, and gaslight. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps switch on a quiet fan for that soft background hum. And let's step together into this eerie world of Victorian healing. I write this account in the autumn of my years, when the gas lamps of London seem dimmer than they once did, and the fog that creeps along the Thames carries with it not merely the chill of November, but the weight of all that I have witnessed. My hand, which once held the instruments of healing with such certainty, now trembles as I set down these words. Yet I must write them, for silence has kept too many secrets, and I have carried mine long enough. It was in the year 1883 that I first encountered the apparatus that would come to define my understanding of medicine, morality, and the terrible distance between what we call progress and what we might, in quieter moments, recognise as fear. I was then a physician of some standing, recently appointed to a private establishment in Harley Street, where ladies of means came seeking relief from afflictions that their husbands could not name, and society would not acknowledge. The consulting room was always the same, thick velvet curtains the colour of claret, pulled against the afternoon light, mahogany furniture polished to such brilliance that one could see one's reflection, distorted and uncertain in its depths. The air held the scent of beeswax and carbolic soap, and beneath it, something else, the faint sweetness of ether perhaps, or simply the accumulated breath of 1,000 anxious visits. The carpet, deep green with patterns of acanthus leaves, muffled all footsteps, so that patients arrived as though carried on silence itself. I'd been trained at Guy's Hospital, where the wards smelled of poverty and lie, where consumptives coughed through the night, and the surgeons moved with grim efficiency through their morning rounds. That world had been honest in its suffering. Here, in these comfortable rooms where teacups rested on lace doilies, and the wallpaper cost more than a working man's yearly wage, suffering wore a different face. It whispered, it hid behind gloved hands and downcast eyes. It announced itself through headaches, fainting spells, and what my colleagues term nervous exhaustion. The ladies came with their mothers or their husbands. They came in carriages that waited outside, the horses stamping in the cold, their breath making clouds in the winter air. They came wearing layers of silk and wool, their waists compressed to dimensions that seemed to defy the capacity of human lungs, their hair arranged in elaborate constructions that must have taken their maids an hour to complete. They sat in my consulting room with their hands folded in their laps, and they told me, in voices barely above a whisper, of the trembling that seized them without warning, of the weeping they could not control, of the sensation that their very hearts would burst from their chests. We called it hysteria. The term came from the Greek, my professors had explained, from the word for womb, for it was understood that the affliction arose from that most female of organs, that mysterious seat of life and feeling which, when disturbed, could send poisonous vapours throughout the entire system. The symptoms were manifold and peculiar. Some women spoke of a choking sensation, as though an invisible hand closed about their throats. Others described numbness in their limbs, or convulsions, or fits of laughter that turned without warning to sobs. Many complained of insomnia, of dreams that left them exhausted, of a restlessness that no amount of laudanum could quiet. The textbooks were quite clear on the matter. Hysteria afflicted those of a nervous disposition, particularly women of the better classes, whose refined sensibilities made them vulnerable to overstimulation. Reading novels was considered a contributing factor. So was the theatre, dancing, any excitement of the passions. The prescribed treatments included bed rest, isolation from family and friends, a diet of milk and bland foods, and the strict avoidance of all mental exertion. Some physicians advocated marriage as a cure, others absolute celibacy. Some recommended travel to the seaside, others insisted that the patient must not leave her room. I confess that in my early years of practice I accepted these theories without question. I had been taught them by men of learning and experience, men whose names appeared in the medical journals, whose lectures drew crowds of eager students. If they said that hysteria arose from a wandering womb, from an excess of female feeling, from the inherent weakness of the feminine constitution, then who was I to doubt them? The apparatus arrived in the spring of 1884. Doctor. Mortimer Granville, a colleague whose practice occupied rooms 2 floors above mine, had acquired one of the new electromechanical devices recently developed for the treatment of neurasthenia and related conditions. He invited several of us to observe a demonstration, and on a Thursday afternoon in May, I climbed the stairs to his consulting room, my curiosity tempered by the skepticism that medical men must cultivate if they are not to be taken in by every charlatan and quack. The machine sat upon a mahogany table, its brass fittings gleaming in the gaslight. It was smaller than I had expected, no larger than a hatbox, with a curved wooden handle attached by a flexible cord to the main body of the device. The mechanism itself was contained within a polished wooden case, and through a small glass window one could see the arrangement of springs and gears within. A key protruded from one side, and when wound, it set the internal machinery in motion with a sound like a grandfather clock, steady and rhythmic. Dr. Granville explained the principles with evident pride. The device produced mechanical vibrations which, when applied to the affected areas, would stimulate the nerves and restore proper function to the tissues. It was based, he said, on the same therapeutic principles as massage, but far more efficient and reliable. A skilled practitioner could spend hours manipulating the muscles and still fail to achieve the desired result. But this apparatus could accomplish the same work in a fraction of the time, with greater precision and consistency. The patient for the demonstration was a woman of perhaps 30 years, though she carried herself with the weariness of someone much older. Her name was Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, and she had been under Dr. Granville's care for some months, suffering from what he described as severe hysterical paroxysm. She entered the room with her eyes cast down, accompanied by a nurse who guided her to the examination couch with gentle touches on her elbow. She wore a grey dress of good quality but subdued design, and her hands, I noticed, moved constantly in her lap, plucking at her skirt, smoothing it, folding and refolding a corner of the fabric. Dr. Granville spoke to her in the tone one might use with a nervous child. He assured her that the procedure would cause no discomfort, that she had nothing to fear, that she would soon feel much improved. Mrs. Thornton nodded without speaking. The nurse helped her to recline upon the couch, arranging her skirts for modesty, placing a cushion beneath her head. A screen was positioned to shield the lower portion of her body from the view of those assembled, though we could see her face and upper body clearly enough. What followed I shall describe with the directness that the passage of years permits, though at the time we spoke of it only in the most clinical terms, wrapping each observation in layers of medical terminology so that we need not confront what we were truly witnessing. Dr. Granville wound the mechanism. The device began its steady thrumming, a sound that seemed to fill the room despite its modest volume. He applied the curved handle to Mrs. Thornton's temples first, then to the base of her skull, then to her shoulders and arms. She lay quite still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. After several minutes of this preparatory work, Dr. Granville moved the screen slightly and applied the device to areas beneath, to the lower abdomen and pelvic region, maintaining the treatment there for perhaps 10 minutes more. The change in Mrs. Thornton was gradual but unmistakable. Her breathing deepened and quickened, a flush rose in her cheeks. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly relaxed and opened. Her body seemed to soften, to release some terrible tension that had held it rigid. Then came a series of quick, sharp breaths, a trembling that moved through her entire frame, and finally a deep exhalation, almost a sigh, followed by a stillness so complete that for a moment I feared something had gone terribly wrong. But no. Dr. Granville withdrew the device and set it aside. Mrs. Thornton opened her eyes. They were brighter than before, clearer, as though some fog had lifted. The nurse helped her to sit upright. offered her a glass of water, adjusted her clothing with practiced discretion. Mrs. Thornton drank slowly, then looked up at Dr. Granville with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been something else entirely. Something more complicated, more difficult to name. "How do you feel?" Dr. Granville asked. "Much relieved, Doctor," she said, and her voice, which had been thin and strained when she entered, now carried a warmth and ease that had been absent before. "The heaviness has lifted. I feel as though I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks." We were invited to examine her pulse, which had indeed grown steadier and stronger. Her colour was improved. The trembling in her hands had ceased. Dr. Granville declared the treatment a complete success, noting that Mrs. Thornton would require regular sessions, perhaps twice weekly, to maintain the improvement and prevent a return of symptoms. As we departed, he took orders for similar devices. 3 of the physicians present, including myself, arranged for their acquisition. The cost was considerable, but the results, we agreed, were remarkable. Here at last was a rational, scientific approach to a condition that had long defied effective treatment. No more hours of exhausting manual manipulation, no more uncertain outcomes. Simply wind the mechanism, apply the device, and observe the beneficial effects. I received my own apparatus within a fortnight. It arrived in a wooden crate packed with straw, accompanied by detailed instructions for its use and maintenance. I had it installed in the small treatment room adjacent to my consulting chamber, a space I had previously used for minor procedures and examinations. The room had a single window overlooking the back garden, and I arranged for a heavy curtain to be hung there, ensuring complete privacy. A new examination couch was purchased, broader and better padded than the old one, a table for the device, a screen, everything arranged with attention to both medical efficiency and the sensibilities of my patients. The first woman I treated with the apparatus was Lady Catherine Ashford, wife of a prominent barrister, mother of 4 children, aged 37 years. She had been consulting me for nearly 6 months, regarding what she described as an overwhelming melancholy, coupled with periods of inexplicable agitation. She could not sleep. She could not eat. She found no pleasure in her children, no comfort in her husband's company, no solace in prayer or charitable works or any of the activities that had once given her life meaning and purpose. I had prescribed bed rest, which made her condition worse. I had recommended a change of scene, but the family's month in Brighton had brought no improvement. I had suggested that perhaps she was working herself too hard with social obligations, and she had withdrawn from all engagements, only to find that isolation increased her despair. Now she sat in my consulting room with her shoulders hunched forward, her hands gripping her reticule so tightly that her knuckles showed white through the thin leather of her gloves. I explained the new treatment as Dr. Granville had explained it to me, a therapeutic application of mechanical vibration to stimulate the nerves and restore proper function to the system. Many women had found it remarkably beneficial. The procedure was entirely respectable, medically approved, and would be conducted with the utmost attention to her comfort and dignity. Lady Catherine listened with her eyes fixed upon her hands. When I finished speaking, she was silent for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and I saw in her face an expression that haunts me still, a kind of desperate hope mixed with profound shame, as though she were both drowning and embarrassed to be seen struggling in the water. "Will it help, Doctor?" she asked. "I believe it will," I said, and I meant it. I truly believed that I was offering relief, that I was practicing good medicine according to the best scientific understanding of the day. She agreed to the treatment. I rang for the nurse, Mrs. Blackwood, a widow of middle years, who had assisted me for several years, and whose discretion was absolute. Together we led Lady Catherine to the treatment room. Mrs. Blackwood helped her to remove her outer garments and to recline upon the couch. I wound the mechanism, explaining each step as I proceeded, describing the sensation she should expect, assuring her that any discomfort would be minimal and temporary. The device hummed to life in my hands. I began with the temples, as I had observed, then the neck and shoulders. Lady Catherine lay rigid beneath my ministrations, her body tense as iron. I spoke to her in low, steady tones, encouraging her to breathe deeply, to allow the treatment to take effect. Gradually, slowly, I felt her begin to relax. When I moved the device to the lower regions, applying it through the layers of her clothing as modesty required, Mrs. Blackwood stood by with her eyes averted, ready to assist if needed. I maintained the treatment for perhaps 15 minutes, observing carefully for signs of the beneficial response. It came at last, the quickened breathing, the flush, the trembling, and then the deep, shuddering release that signalled, according to all medical authority, the restoration of proper nervous function and the relief of hysterical congestion. Lady Catherine lay still afterwards, her eyes closed, tears sliding silently down her temples. Mrs. Blackwood wiped them away gently with a clean cloth and helped her to sit upright. I withdrew to allow the patient time to compose herself, returning only when Mrs. Blackwood indicated that she was ready. "How do you feel?" I asked, as Dr. Granville had asked. Lady Catherine looked at me with eyes that seemed to see something far beyond the walls of that small room. "I feel," she said slowly, carefully, "as though I have been permitted to rest for the first time in years." I prescribed a course of treatments, twice weekly for a month, to be reassessed thereafter. Lady Catherine kept every appointment. Her melancholy lifted, her appetite returned. She resumed her social engagements and reported that she found pleasure once again in her children's company. Her husband, who had been desperately worried, came to thank me personally, pressing my hand with gratitude and discreetly increasing his payment beyond my usual fees. Word spread, as word always does in the circles of the wealthy and well-connected. Soon my appointment book was filled with women seeking the treatment. They came for headaches, for insomnia, for the vapours, for nervous exhaustion, for melancholy, for irritability, for all the myriad complaints that physicians grouped under the broad category of hysteria. They came referred by their regular doctors, by their friends, by their sisters and cousins and mothers, who had themselves experienced the relief the apparatus could provide. I became known as something of a specialist in the treatment of female nervous disorders. My practice flourished. I acquired a second device, then a third, so that I might treat multiple patients in a day without the delay of allowing the mechanism to cool between sessions. I trained Mrs. Blackwood in the proper application technique, though I always conducted the initial consultation myself and supervised the most delicate aspects of the treatment. The women who came to me were not uniform in their suffering, though we used the same diagnostic terms for all of them. There was Mrs. Elizabeth Winters, a young bride of barely 18, married to a man 3 times her age, who came complaining of violent headaches and an inability to tolerate her husband's presence. There was Miss Sarah Pemberton, a governess of 35, never married, supporting her elderly parents on her meagre salary, who spoke of feeling as though she was slowly suffocating, as though the very air had grown too thick to breathe. There was the Countess of something or other, I was asked not to record her true name, who arrived veiled and departed by the back entrance, suffering from fits of weeping so severe that she could not fulfill her social duties. They all responded to the treatment. They all reported relief. They all returned week after week, month after month, for the sessions that restored their equilibrium and allowed them to continue with their lives. I thought I was healing them. I thought I was advancing the cause of medical science. I thought I was a good physician, perhaps even an excellent one, applying the latest therapeutic techniques to alleviate genuine suffering. It was Mrs. Blackwood who first planted the seed of doubt. We were in the treatment room one evening after the last patient had departed. I was cleaning the device, wiping down the brass fittings with a soft cloth, while Mrs. Blackwood tidied the couch and folded the linens. The gas lamps hissed softly. Rain tapped against the window. Outside, London went about its evening business. Carriages rattling over cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the distant sound of a hurdy-gurdy playing some popular tune. "Doctor," Mrs. Blackwood said, and something in her tone made me pause in my work. "May I speak freely?" "Of course," I said, though I felt a prick of unease. Mrs. Blackwood was not one to ask permission before speaking. She was capable and direct, and her judgment in medical matters was often sounder than that of younger physicians fresh from their studies. She folded the last towel and placed it in the cupboard before turning to face me. "These women who come to us," she said carefully, "do you not think it curious that the treatment for their various afflictions is always the same? That the remedy for melancholy and the remedy for nervous excitement and the remedy for sleeplessness are all identical?" I set down the cloth and the device. "The apparatus addresses the underlying nervous dysfunction," I said, repeating what I had been taught. "The symptoms may vary, but the root cause is the same, a disturbance in the nervous system that requires mechanical stimulation to correct. Is that what we are correcting? Mrs. Blackwood asked quietly. What do you mean? She was silent for a moment, choosing her words. I've been a nurse for 20 years, Doctor. I've seen much suffering and many treatments. I have seen what helps and what does not. And I have seen the faces of these women when they arrive and when they leave. The improvement is unmistakable, I said. You have observed it yourself. Oh yes, she agreed. They are improved. They are calmer, happier, better able to face their lives. But I wonder, Doctor, I wonder what it is we are truly treating. Hysteria, I said firmly. Nervous exhaustion. Disorders of the feminine constitution. Mrs. Blackwood looked at me with something like pity. Doctor, she said gently, I am a woman. I know what the device does. I know what that trembling means, that final release. I have felt it myself, in private, in the dark, in moments I would not speak of in daylight. Every woman knows it, though we are taught from girlhood never to acknowledge it, never to seek it, never to admit that such feelings exist within us. I felt heat rise to my face. Mrs. Blackwood, I must ask you not to speak of such matters. What you are suggesting is... True, she said simply. What I am suggesting is true, and you know it is true, though you hide it from yourself behind medical terminology and talk of nervous dysfunction. The device provides a physical release that these women cannot obtain elsewhere. Their husbands do not know how to give it to them. Society forbids them from seeking it themselves, so they come to us, to you, and we give them what they need, and we call it medicine, so that no one need be ashamed. I stood frozen, the words of denial on my lips, but they would not come. Because even as she spoke, even as I wanted to protest and lecture her on proper medical understanding, I knew that she was right. I had known it all along, in some deep, unacknowledged corner of my mind. I had known it from the first demonstration, from the look on Mrs. Thornton's face, from the way the women returned again and again, not as one returns to take an unpleasant but necessary medicine, but as one might return to a source of comfort and relief that was otherwise denied. It helps them, I said finally, weakly. Whatever the mechanism, it helps them to bear their lives. Does it? Mrs. Blackwood asked, or does it merely make them able to endure what should not be endured? She left me then, taking her cloak from its hook and departing through the back entrance. I remained alone in the treatment room, surrounded by the instruments of my profession, and for the first time I looked at the device with eyes unclouded by the comforting veil of medical authority. It sat upon its table, innocent and gleaming, a collection of brass and wood and carefully arranged springs, a mechanism designed to produce a specific physical response through mechanical stimulation. Nothing more and nothing less. We had given it a medical purpose because we could not acknowledge its true function. We had wrapped it in the language of science and therapy because the alternative was to admit what it actually did, to admit that women had physical needs and desires, that they experienced sensations which society insisted they should not feel, that their bodies were not merely vessels for childbearing and moral purity, but living, feeling entities with their own demands and requirements. The hysteria we treated was not a disease. It was a condition created by the very society that condemned it. We told women that they must be pure, passive, devoid of carnal feeling. We taught them that any stirring of physical desire was shameful, evidence of moral weakness or mental disturbance. We confined them in clothing that restricted their breathing and movement. We limited their education, their activities, their freedoms. We gave them no useful work, no real purpose beyond ornamental domesticity. And when the inevitable result was despair, frustration, and nervous exhaustion, we declared them hysterical and applied our machines. The device was not a cure, it was a pressure valve. It allowed women to experience, under medical supervision, and with clinical justification, what they could not seek or acknowledge in any other context. It gave them temporary relief from the accumulated tensions of their circumscribed lives, and then they returned to those lives, unchanged, until the pressure built again, and they required another treatment. I should have stopped then. I should have put away the device and refused to continue the charade, but I did not. Because what was the alternative? To tell my patients that they were not ill, merely imprisoned by social convention. to suggest that their melancholy and frustration arose not from dysfunction of the womb, but from the suffocating limitations placed upon them by law and custom. To admit that I, a physician sworn to healing, was complicit in a system that created the very suffering I claimed to relieve? I continued the treatments. I told myself that I was helping, that whatever the underlying truth, the women who came to me left in better spirits, better able to cope with their circumstances. I told myself that medicine often works through means we do not fully understand, that the important thing was the beneficial result, not the precise mechanism. But the doubt, once awakened, would not be quieted. I began to observe more carefully, to listen more closely to what my patients said and did not say. I began to recognize patterns I had previously overlooked. Lady Catherine Ashford, whose melancholy had lifted so dramatically, had a husband who regarded her primarily as the manager of his household and the mother of his children. He was not cruel, but he was indifferent, conducting his emotional and physical life elsewhere, visiting his wife's bed only for the purpose of procreation, and then with a perfunctory efficiency that suggested duty rather than affection. Mrs. Elizabeth Winters, the young bride with violent headaches, had been married to secure her family's fortunes. Her elderly husband treated her as a possession, a beautiful ornament to display at social functions. She had told me once in an unguarded moment that she felt like a doll in a shop window, admired perhaps, but never touched with any genuine tenderness or regard. Miss Sarah Pemberton, the governess, had devoted her youth to caring for other people's children. She had set aside all personal desires to support her parents. She had no life of her own, no prospect of marriage, no hope of anything beyond endless repetition of the same thankless duties until age or illness rendered her unable to continue. These women were not suffering from disorders of the womb. They were suffering from lives that gave them no voice, no choice, no opportunity to exist as full human beings rather than as appendages to fathers, husbands, and employers. The device provided momentary relief, but it changed nothing fundamental. It allowed them to continue in circumstances that slowly crushed the life from them, that turned them into pale shadows of what they might have been. I thought of stopping. I thought of speaking out. But what would I say? That the medical establishment was wrong? That hysteria was not a disease but a symptom of social oppression? That the treatments we provided were merely temporary palliatives that allowed an unjust system to perpetuate itself? Who would listen? My colleagues were men of science, trained as I had been, believing as I had believed. The women themselves could not speak openly of such matters without risking their reputations and social standing. And I was complicit. I'd built my practice, my reputation, my income upon the continuation of the very system I now questioned. So I did what many do when faced with an uncomfortable truth. I continued as before, but with less certainty, less pride. I applied the device and collected my fees. I listened to the grateful testimonials of patients and their families. I published nothing, said nothing, allowed the world to believe that I was simply a skilled practitioner of a legitimate therapeutic technique. The device itself underwent refinements. New models appeared, with improved mechanisms and greater efficiency. Other physicians adopted the treatment. It became quite fashionable among a certain class of patient. Some women had their own devices at home prescribed for self-treatment under medical guidance. The manufacturers prospered. The medical journals published articles on proper technique and clinical outcomes, and through it all, I watched and said nothing. There was one patient, however, who forced me to confront what I had become. Her name was Miss Eleanor Hartwell, and she came to me in the winter of 1887 at the urging of her brother, who was desperate for some relief for his sister's troubled state. Miss Hartwell was 32 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a keen intelligence that she had cultivated through extensive reading and study. She had attempted, at one point, to attend lectures at the Royal Institution, disguised in men's clothing, and had been discovered and expelled with considerable scandal. She had written articles on scientific subjects under a masculine pseudonym, only to have them rejected when her true identity became known. She had, in short, committed the unforgivable sin of wanting to use her mind in ways that society reserved exclusively for men. Her family had responded by confining her more strictly. No more lectures, no more writing. No more books beyond the lightest novels and ladies' magazines. She was to concern herself with needlework, with music, with the running of her brother's household, where she lived as a dependent. She was to abandon her unseemly intellectual pursuits and cultivate the gentle, passive virtues appropriate to her sex. The result was predictable. She grew pale and listless. She lost her appetite. She suffered from insomnia and violent headaches. She had fainting spells. She wept uncontrollably. She exhibited, in other words, all the classic symptoms of severe hysteria. Her brother brought her to me with evident distress. He was fond of his sister, in his way, but he did not understand her. He could not comprehend why she insisted on pursuing studies that would never bring her any practical benefit, why she could not be content with the comfortable life he provided, why she persisted in making herself and everyone around her miserable by desiring what she could never have. I conducted the initial consultation with Miss Hartwell alone, as was my custom. She sat in my consulting room with her hands folded, her eyes cast down, every inch the picture of feminine fragility and submission. But when I asked her to describe her symptoms, she looked up at me, and I saw in her eyes not the vague distress of the typical hysteric, but a clear, focused anger. "You wish to know my symptoms, doctor?" she said. "Very well, I shall tell you. I'm unable to sleep because my mind will not be quiet. It wishes to think, to analyze, to understand. But I am forbidden all materials that might feed it. I'm forced to sit idle while my brother and his friends discuss topics about which I know more than they do. Yet I must pretend ignorance lest I embarrass them with my unfeminine learning. I am expected to spend my days in activities that require no thought-sowing, arranging flowers, paying social calls during which we discuss nothing of substance. I am 32 years old, doctor, and I am being slowly starved to death, not of food, but of any purpose or meaning." I should have been moved by her words. I should have recognized in them a truth that applied not only to Miss Hartwell, but to many of the women I treated. But instead, I felt a surge of irritation. She was making my work difficult. She was refusing to play the role of the grateful patient who simply needed to be guided back to proper feminine feeling and function. "Miss Hartwell," I said carefully, "you must understand that this very attitude is part of your affliction. The female mind is not constructed for the rigors of scientific study. The nervous system of women is more delicate, more easily overstrained by intellectual exertion. What you perceive as a desire for learning is actually a form of nervous excitement that exhausts your resources and produces the symptoms you now experience." She looked at me for a long moment. "You do not believe that," she said quietly. "I beg your pardon." "You do not believe what you just told me. I can see it in your face. You are reciting what you were taught, what you are expected to say, but you do not believe it. You cannot believe it, or you would be a fool, and I do not think you are a fool, doctor." I felt myself flush with anger, and something else shame, perhaps, at being seen so clearly. "Miss Hartwell, I'm trying to help you, but I cannot do so if you persist in this combative attitude." "Combative," she repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose I am combative. I'm fighting for my very life, doctor, for my right to exist as something other than an ornamental invalid. And you, what are you fighting for, or have you already surrendered?" I stood abruptly. "I think we should proceed with the examination and treatment. If you will go with Mrs. Blackwood—" "No," Miss Hartwell said, not moving from her chair. "I will not." "I beg your pardon?" "I have heard about your treatment, doctor, about your miraculous device that relieves hysteria. I know what it does. I know why women return again and again for it, and I will not submit to it because it changes nothing. It will give me a moment's relief, perhaps, and then I will return to my brother's house and my empty life, and in a few weeks I will be back here, seeking the same temporary release, and nothing will ever change. That is what you offer, doctor. Not healing, just enough relief to make the prison bearable." She stood then, gathering her cloak and reticule. "I will tell my brother that you examined me, and found my case too severe for treatment. Perhaps he will send me to an asylum. Perhaps that is what I deserve for refusing to be what everyone wishes me to be. But I will not participate in the pretense that what you do here is medicine." She left. I sat alone in my consulting room, staring at the door through which she had passed, and I knew that she was right. About all of it. The device, the treatments, my complicity, my cowardice. But I continued nonetheless, because I was a physician, and this was my practice, and I had built my life upon it. Because the women who came to me left feeling better, and that was worth something, even if it changed nothing fundamental, because I did not know what else to do. The years passed, my practice flourished. I became wealthy. I moved to a larger establishment with more consulting rooms, hired additional nurses, acquired more devices. I treated hundreds of women, perhaps thousands. I received grateful letters from patients and their families. I was invited to speak at medical societies. I was, by all external measures, a success. Yet Miss Hartwell's words echoed in my mind with increasing frequency. I began to notice things I had overlooked before, the way some women flinched when I entered the treatment room, the way others relaxed only when Mrs. Blackwood was present, the carefully neutral expressions they maintained, the way they never quite met my eyes, the sense that they were enduring something rather than receiving care. I noticed how many of the women who came to me regularly showed no signs of improvement in their overall circumstances. Their marriages remained cold, their lives remained narrow. They came for treatment as regularly as they might come for afternoon tea, not because they were seeking a cure, but because they had found a source of temporary relief that was otherwise unavailable to them. I began to feel like a kind of merchant, selling brief moments of physical release to women who had been taught that their bodies were shameful and their desires evidence of disease. I wound the mechanism and applied the device, and I collected my fees, and I told myself that I was helping. But increasingly I wondered if I was not instead simply profiting from their imprisonment. In 1889, I received an invitation to participate in a medical conference in Paris. The topic was advances in the treatment of nervous disorders, and several papers were to be presented on electromechanical therapy for hysteria. I'd been invited to contribute based on my extensive experience with the technique. I went because it seemed expected, and because some part of me still hoped to find, among my colleagues, someone who shared my doubts, someone who questioned the foundations upon which we had built our practices. The conference was held in a grand lecture hall with gilded mouldings and crystal chandeliers. Physicians from across Europe gathered to present their findings and debate the finer points of technique. Papers were read describing the optimal duration of treatment, the proper positioning of the device, the frequency of sessions required to maintain improvement. There were discussions of new models, new refinements, new applications. No one questioned the fundamental premise. No one suggested that hysteria might not be a disease at all, but rather a collection of symptoms produced by social conditions. No one acknowledged what the device actually did, or why it provided relief. We spoke in carefully neutral terms of therapeutic vibration and the restoration of nervous function, and we congratulated ourselves on our scientific progress. I listened to it all with growing revulsion. These men, these physicians who claimed to be healers, who took oaths to first do no harm, were describing human beings as though they were machines requiring mechanical adjustment. They discussed women's bodies with clinical detachment, as though the patients themselves were not thinking, feeling individuals, but merely collections of symptoms to be managed. On the third day of the conference, during a particularly tedious presentation on the comparative effectiveness of various device models, I stood and walked out. I did not return for the remaining sessions. I took the train back to Calais that same afternoon, crossed the Channel in a grey drizzle, and returned to London feeling as though I had awakened from a long and troubling dream. I did not immediately cease the treatments. That would have required more courage than I possessed. But I began to change the way I conducted my practice. I spent more time in consultation, listening to what my patients actually said, rather than filtering their words through the diagnostic categories I had been taught. I asked them about their lives, their marriages, their daily activities, their hopes and frustrations. I began to see them not as cases of hysteria, but as individuals trapped in circumstances that offered them little freedom or fulfillment. Some of them, when given the opportunity to speak freely, revealed stories of profound unhappiness. Marriages entered into for financial security rather than affection. Husbands who regarded them as property or ignored them entirely. Minds starved of stimulation. Bodies confined by layers of restrictive clothing and social prohibition. lives lived in service to others with no consideration for their own needs or desires. I began cautiously to offer different forms of treatment. I suggested exercise, not the mild strolls deemed appropriate for ladies, but vigorous walking, swimming, activities that allowed the body to move freely and breathe deeply. I recommended engagement in charitable work, not the ornamental committee membership that required nothing but attendance at tea parties, but actual labour that gave purpose and meaning. I advised some women to take up serious study, to read substantial books, to use their minds in ways that society discouraged. These recommendations were not always well received. Husbands complained that I was encouraging their wives in unseemly behaviour. Families worried that I was making their daughters and sisters more difficult to manage. Some patients left my care, seeking physicians who would simply apply the device without troubling them with suggestions for changing their lives, but others responded. Lady Catherine Ashford began volunteering at a charity hospital, assisting with the care of poor women and their children. The work exhausted her, but it also gave her a sense of purpose that the endless round of social calls had never provided. Her melancholy did not disappear entirely, but it became manageable, a shadow rather than an overwhelming darkness. Mrs. Elizabeth Winters left her elderly husband. The scandal was considerable, and she lost her place in society, but she moved to a small cottage by the sea and took up painting. She wrote to me once, years later, to say that she had never been happier, even in her reduced circumstances. Miss Sarah Pemberton found a position as a teacher at a progressive school for girls, where her intelligence and dedication were valued. She was able to bring her elderly parents to live near her, ensuring their care while also pursuing work that gave her satisfaction. Not all stories ended so well. Many women could not or would not leave their circumstances. They remained in loveless marriages, in suffocating households, in lives that slowly drained them of vitality and hope. For these women, I continued to provide the device treatment because it gave them some measure of relief, and I had nothing better to offer. But I no longer pretended to myself that I was curing disease. I knew that I was providing a temporary escape, a brief respite from lives that should not have required such desperate measures. I knew that I was, in my own small way, helping to maintain a system that harmed the very people I claimed to heal. Mrs. Blackwood and I never spoke again of our conversation in the treatment room, but I noticed that she began to spend more time with the patients, talking with them before and after treatments, asking about their lives, offering quiet advice and support. She became, in many ways, more important to my practice than I was. The women trusted her. They confided in her. She understood, as I could not, what they endured. In 1891, I encountered Miss Eleanor Hartwell once more. I was walking through Regent's Park on a spring afternoon when I saw her sitting on a bench, reading a thick volume that looked like a scientific text. She was dressed simply but well, and there was a calmness about her that had been absent during our consultation. I approached hesitantly, unsure whether she would wish to speak with me. But when she looked up and recognized me, she smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that surprised me. "Dr. Ashworth," she said, closing her book, "how unexpected to meet you here." "Miss Hartwell? You are well, I hope?" "Very well, thank you. I've been living in Switzerland for the past year. My brother finally agreed to provide me with a modest independence, and I have been able to pursue my studies without interference. I am translating scientific papers from German into English. It is not the career I might have wished for, but it gives me purpose and allows me to contribute in some small way to the advancement of knowledge." I sat beside her on the bench, feeling the need to say something I had not said before. "Miss Hartwell, I wish to apologize. You were right about everything you said in my consulting room. I did not listen. I was too invested in my own understanding, my own importance, to hear what you were trying to tell me." She looked at me thoughtfully. "You are apologizing now because you have come to see the truth of it. That is worth something, doctor. Many men never reach that point at all." "I have changed my practice," I told her. "I still use the device when patients request it, but I try now to address the underlying circumstances that produce their distress. I'm not certain I'm doing much good, but I'm at least trying to do less harm." "That is more than most physicians manage," she said gently. "The system is larger than any individual. You cannot change it alone. But perhaps, in your small way, you are helping some women to see that their suffering is not inevitable, not a product of their own weakness or disease, but a result of circumstances that might be altered. We spoke for some time longer about medicine, about society, about the slow and painful progress towards a world where women might be regarded as fully human rather than as defective versions of men. When we parted, she gave me a copy of a book she had translated, inscribing it with words I've kept close to my heart. For Dr. Ashworth, who learned to question. That is where all wisdom begins. I continued my practice for another decade. The device treatments gradually became less central to my work. I focused more on consultation, on listening, on helping women to understand and articulate their own needs and desires. I wrote papers never published questioning the diagnosis of hysteria and the assumptions about female physiology that underlay it. I spoke privately with younger physicians, hoping to plant seeds of doubt in their minds, as Mrs. Blackwood had planted them in mine. In 1901, I retired from active practice. I was 63 years old, tired, and increasingly aware that the world was changing in ways I could not fully comprehend. New theories were emerging. The rigid Victorian certainties were beginning to crumble. Women were demanding education, employment, the vote. The old order, which had seemed so solid and permanent, was revealing itself to be as ephemeral as morning mist. I spent my retirement years writing, reading, and reflecting. I corresponded with several former patients, including Lady Catherine Ashford, who had become an advocate for improved conditions in charity hospitals, and Mrs. Elizabeth Winters, whose paintings had begun to attract serious attention. I attended lectures at the Royal Society, where I sometimes saw women in the audience, no longer forced to disguise themselves or sit in segregated sections. The device itself became obsolete. Medical understanding of hysteria evolved. The diagnosis gradually fell out of favour as physicians began to recognise that many of the symptoms they had attributed to disorders of the womb were actually manifestations of depression, anxiety, trauma, or simply the normal human response to abnormal circumstances. The treatments changed, the terminology changed, but the underlying truth that women had been pathologized for experiencing feelings and desires that men took for granted took much longer to be acknowledged. Now, in the final years of my life, I look back on my career with complicated feelings. I helped many women, or so I tell myself. I provided them with relief when they desperately needed it, but I also participated in a system that harmed them, that treated their legitimate needs and frustrations as symptoms of disease, that offered them temporary palliatives rather than fundamental change. The device sits now in a glass case in my study, a relic of a particular moment in medical history. I keep it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It is a beautiful object in its way, all polished brass and careful engineering. It represents the confidence of Victorian science, the belief that every problem could be solved through proper application of mechanical principles. It also represents our blindness, our willingness to see what we expected to see, rather than what was actually before us. Would you have trusted the doctors had you seen what I saw? Would you have questioned the comfortable certainties of medical authority, or would you, like me, have accepted what you were taught because it came wrapped in the language of science and progress? I ask these questions not to excuse my own failings, but to understand them. We are all products of our times, shaped by the beliefs and assumptions of the societies in which we live, but we are also individuals, capable of thought and choice. I could have questioned earlier. I could have spoken out. I could have refused to participate in treatments that I knew, in my deepest heart, were not truly medicine, but management ways of making unbearable circumstances barely tolerable. I did not do these things, or I did them only partially, too late, with too little courage. That is the burden I carry into my final years. Not the burden of having done deliberate harm. I do not believe I was cruel or malicious, but the burden of having failed to do enough good, of having been complicit in a system that diminished and confined the women who came to me seeking help. The world changes slowly. Progress, when it comes, often arrives too late for those who needed it most. The women I treated in the 1880s and 1890s lived out their lives under the constraints of Victorian morality and Victorian medicine. Their daughters and granddaughters have inherited a somewhat freer world, though by no means a fully just one. The particular forms of oppression change, but the fundamental patterns, the tendency to pathologize women's experiences, to treat their testimony with skepticism, to offer superficial remedies rather than addressing root causes, these patterns persist. I think often of Mrs. Blackwood, who understood more than I did despite having no formal medical training. She knew, from living in a woman's body, in a woman's life, what the device actually did and what the women who came to us actually needed. She knew that the trembling we produced with our brass and springs was not a cure for disease, but a release from tension, a brief moment of physical satisfaction in lives that offered little other pleasure or autonomy. She knew, and she helped them anyway, because what else was there to do? Turn them away? Let them suffer without even that small relief? Judge them for seeking something that should never have been forbidden or pathologized in the first place? I think often, too, of Miss Eleanor Hartwell, who refused the treatment because she saw clearly that it changed nothing fundamental. She was right, but not all women had her strength or her options. For many, the temporary relief the device provided was the only respite they would ever know from lives of quiet desperation. Could you call it healing, if it silenced the cry? That is the question that has haunted me through all these years. The women left my consulting room calmer, more composed, better able to face their circumstances. But their circumstances remained unchanged. The marriages that stifled them, the social conventions that limited them, the legal structures that denied them autonomy, all of these persisted. We had not healed them. We had merely made them better able to endure. True healing would have required not a device, but a revolution. It would have required dismantling the entire edifice of assumptions about women's nature, capabilities, and proper role in society. It would have required acknowledging that hysteria was not a disease, but a diagnosis we invented to explain and control behaviors that threatened the social order. That revolution did not happen in my lifetime, though I have seen the beginnings of it. Women now attend universities. They enter professions. They own property. They are beginning to claim the rights and freedoms that men have always assumed as their natural due. The progress is uneven and incomplete, but it is progress nonetheless. Perhaps you think progress is kind. I once thought so too. I thought that medical science was steadily advancing, that each new device and technique brought us closer to true understanding and effective treatment. I thought that I was part of that noble march forward, contributing to the betterment of humanity through the application of rational principles. But progress is not kind. It is blind and often cruel. It tramples over those who cannot keep pace. It sacrifices individuals to abstract principles. It justifies present suffering in the name of future benefit. And sometimes what we call progress is merely the same old oppression dressed in new language, the same old cruelties made efficient through better technology. The device was progress. It was more efficient than manual manipulation. It produced more reliable results. It allowed physicians to treat more patients in less time. It was, by every measure of medical advancement, an improvement over previous methods. But it was not healing. It was management. And in some ways, that made it worse, because it gave us the illusion that we were solving the problem when in fact we were merely making it easier to ignore. I write these words in the spring of 1906. I am an old man now, my hands unsteady, my eyes failing. The world I knew is passing away. Queen Victoria is gone, and with her an entire era. The 20th century has arrived, bringing changes I cannot fully comprehend. Motor cars, moving pictures, wireless telegraphy, aeroplanes. The pace of transformation is dizzying, yet some things remain constant. Women still come to physicians complaining of exhaustion, melancholy, and vague physical distress. The diagnoses have changed. We speak now of neurasthenia, of nervous prostration. But the underlying pattern persists. When women's lives are constrained and their voices silenced, their bodies speak the distress that they cannot otherwise express. I wonder what future generations will make of us, of the Victorian physicians who treated hysteria with mechanical devices. Will they judge us harshly? Will they see us as blind fools, unable to recognize what was plain before our eyes? Or will they understand that we were trapped by our own time, limited by assumptions we could not think past? I hope they will be wiser than we were. I hope they will listen more carefully to what women say about their own experiences. I hope they will question the comfortable certainties of their age, the accepted wisdom that serves the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. I hope they will have the courage that I lacked, the willingness to speak uncomfortable truths, even when it costs them professionally and socially. But I am not confident. Human nature does not change so quickly. The tendency to dominate, to control, to explain away the suffering of others, these are persistent features of our kind. Each generation thinks itself more enlightened than the last, yet often we merely find new forms for old oppressions, new justifications for ancient cruelties. The device sits in its case, silent now, its mechanism stilled. It is a monument to a particular kind of blindness, the blindness of men who thought they understood women's bodies better than women themselves did, who believed that they could cure with machinery what was actually a problem of the soul and society. I kept it not out of nostalgia, but as a warning. This is what we do when we refuse to listen. This is what we build when we pathologize what we do not understand. This is how we harm in the name of healing, how we oppress in the name of science. On quiet evenings, when the lamps are lit and the house is still, I sometimes take the device from its case and hold it in my hands. It is heavier than I remember, or perhaps my hands have simply grown weaker. The brass is cool and smooth. The mechanism, when I wind it, still produces that steady, rhythmic hum, unchanged after all these years. I think of all the women who felt this vibration, who experienced that particular combination of relief and shame that we called therapeutic. I think of their faces, some grateful, some resentful, some simply resigned. I think of Mrs. Blackwood's words, "Every woman knows it, though we are taught from girlhood never to acknowledge it." We built elaborate medical theories to avoid acknowledging a simple truth. Women have bodies. Those bodies have needs and sensations. Denying those needs and sensations does not make them disappear. It merely transforms them into symptoms that we can then pathologize and treat. The real disease was not hysteria. It was the system that created it. The laws, customs, beliefs and practices that confined women to narrow roles and then labelled them as sick when they struggled against those confines. The device did not cure that disease. It merely managed its symptoms, allowing the system to continue unchanged. I don't know if my words will ever be read beyond these pages. I do not know if anyone will care about the doubts of an elderly physician looking back on his career with regret and uncertainty. But I write them nonetheless, because silence has done enough damage. Because someone should acknowledge what we did and why we did it. Because the past, if examined honestly, can teach us something about the present and the future. We believed we were curing the mind. We believed we were restoring proper function to disordered systems. We believed in the superiority of our knowledge, the rightness of our methods, the nobility of our intentions. But perhaps we were only trying to silence what we feared in ourselves. The fear that women were not so different from men after all. The fear that the natural order we defended so vigorously was not natural at all, but merely conventional, maintained by force and custom rather than by any inherent truth. The fear that if we acknowledged women's full humanity, their desires, their ambitions, their capacity for independent thought and action, we would have to relinquish the comfortable certainties that gave structure and meaning to our lives. The device was not simply a medical instrument. It was a symbol of that fear, and the lengths to which we would go to avoid confronting it. We wrapped it in the language of science. We published papers about it. We refined its mechanism and improved its efficiency. We did everything except acknowledge what it actually was and what its necessity revealed about the world we had created. That is my confession. That is what I have learned in these long years since I first wound that mechanism and heard its steady hum. Medicine is not separate from society. Science is not neutral. The healer cannot hide behind objectivity when the very definition of disease reflects the prejudices and power structures of his time. I failed many women. I helped some, or so I hope, but I failed many more. I failed them by accepting without sufficient question the teachings of my profession. I failed them by prioritizing my own comfort and success over their genuine well-being. I failed them by offering temporary relief when what they needed was fundamental change. I cannot undo those failures. I cannot return to those consulting rooms and offer different treatment, better counsel, truer understanding. All I can do is set down this account, this testament, to a particular kind of blindness, and hope that those who come after will be wiser and braver than I was. The sun is setting now. The room grows dim. My hand aches from writing, but I'm nearly finished. Outside, I can hear the sounds of the city, the clatter of hooves, the call of vendors, the distant whistle of a train. Life continues. The world turns. And somewhere, women still suffer from the accumulated weight of expectations and restrictions, still seek relief from physicians who may or may not understand the true nature of their distress. I set down my pen. The device sits in its case, a relic of a time we are beginning to leave behind. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if the world will become more just or merely find new forms for old injustices. But I know this. The women were not sick. They were imprisoned, and we, their physicians, were their jailers, even as we told ourselves we were their saviors. That is the truth I have taken a lifetime to understand. That is what the trembling cure revealed, though we refuse to see it. Not the dysfunction of the female body, but the sickness of a society that could not imagine women as fully human, fully capable, fully deserving of the freedoms and dignities we reserved for men. May those who read these words, if any do, learn from my mistakes. May they question what seems certain. May they listen to those whose voices have been dismissed or ignored. May they have the courage to see clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable, even when it threatens everything they believe they know. The gas lamps flicker, the shadows lengthen. An old man sits alone with his memories and his regrets, hoping that the words he has written might spare someone somewhere the errors he committed in the name of healing. We thought we were curing the mind, but we were only silencing what we could not bear to hear. Written in London in the spring of 1906 by a physician who learned too late to listen.